All right. We have a growing group here. Again, thank you so much for coming today. Sarah DeSilvi, Director of Terminology for Gravity Project. We are going to be addressing all of our domains. We have special guests in National Indian Health Board today, and incredibly grateful for them to come. So when we get to the protective factors work, we will be passing the presentation off to them. Next slide. Thanks for joining. Folks are muted upon entry, but we have a lot of conversation throughout. The call is always recorded and available on the Gravity Confluence page after the call. We do encourage folks to use the chat, sending chat messages to everybody. We use it as part of the conversation. I try to facilitate conversation there. Again, so just try to send any comments to everyone. Next slide. We are, as a standards-based initiative, we are required to follow federal antitrust practices guidelines. So any Gravity Project participants have the responsibility to comply fully with federal and state antitrust laws. Individuals speaking or providing written communications shall refrain from any discussion which may provide the basis for an inference that they have agreed to take any action related to prices, services, production, allocation of markets, or any other matter having a market effect. And we just note that we apply them both directly and also try to discourage any behavior that might be construed as antitrust. And again, this is just part of our work as a standards generating entity. Next slide. We're going to be going briefly through announcements, a very, very high level overview of terminology. Then, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about protective factors and really centering National Indian Health Board on perspectives in stress and protective factors. Very, very grateful for their subject matter expertise in our domains and grateful they could be here today. Very high level concepts and instruments. Again, presenting nothing new there. And then we're going to go into toxic stress and person level racism, ethnic and racial discrimination. We have a fair bit of content there, but again, the majority of our time today is centering National Indian Health Board. Next slide. Next slide. So just general announcements. Again, we're in the new domains call, Gravity Terminologies Alternating New Domains and Enhancements, meeting every week, alternating topics. The next meeting for the technical work stream is on April 16th. The topic is on Standards for Trial Use 3.0, updates and roadmap review. Please join us again, Wednesdays, 1 to 2 Eastern Standard Time. And then our next implementation affinity meeting topic is settled. It's May 29th. We're going to be focusing on, in 2025, really on trying to leverage and display how gravity standards improve outcomes and return on investment. Specifically in May, focusing on both provider-driven and patient-driven closed-loop referral standards and perspectives on decreased patient burden and decreased provider burden in both cases. And we are having Together Now and Unite Us as our member leads on that. Next slide. Any questions on that? Okay, next slide. Updated vision statement coming soon. We did just complete our strategy session, but Gravity strives to create a world where health and social care organizations readily share the information needed to effectively meet the social needs of individuals, advance health equity, and improve health outcomes in communities by using standard terminology and technology. Again, updates informed by this group here coming very, very soon. We're just finishing our revisions of our strategic goal and objective session for 2025. Next slide. Grounding lexicon. What is health equity? It's the state in which everyone has a fair and just opportunity to attain their highest level of health. Social determinants of health are the conditions in general which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, critically shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources. And this is where we get into the meat of our work. So we are finally leaning into strengths and protective factors in our work, which are the characteristics or strengths of individuals, families, and communities or societies that act and mitigate risk and promote positive well-being and healthy development. More on that soon. And then we continually address social risks or adverse social conditions associated with poor health. And Again, this is the grounding lexicon. We're finally delving into protective factors and strengths in this session. Next slide. Very, very grateful for our members. We couldn't do what we do without them, leveraging both physical support and expertise throughout our project. Next slide. And this is our roadmap. And I think I might have mentioned this last time, but we did finalize our 2025 fall domains recently. We're going to be leaning in the fall to topics in built environment, which really, we have talked about each of these things from a household level, but really leaning into the community level drivers, food access, neighborhood safety, and access to green space. They're directly interconnected. So looking forward to addressing those domains in the fall. And right now we're doing protective factors, racism, and toxic stress, and working on our enhancements, our as I mentioned, implementation. The technical work stream is working on wrapping up STU 2.3 update and planning for standards for trial use 3.0. Next slide. Trying to get just so all work within Gravity is prioritized. This is really important this time. Like how do things happen within Gravity? We are a collective. So anything that is on the roadmap that you just saw is prioritized by Gravity members. That slide that I showed. Every new domain, every new use case, strategically by the steering committee, and then operationally by the operating committee, which are all member driven. So I want to just note that the work is really truly a collective representative of the voted upon priorities of the whole body and not just one entity. It seems important to note that everything that we do is done in consensus. Next slide. These are our principles, which are always important, critically important now at this time. We couldn't do what we do without acknowledging principles of data justice, and they're woven through these principles: improving personal health outcomes, improving population health equity, ensuring personal control, designing appropriate solutions, ensuring accountability, and preventing, reducing, and remediating harm. Again, always thinking about them when we're making language and making terms and making resources within the implementation guide, and always thinking about them when we're implementing too. If you want to access them, they're available on the Confluence, just like everything that we do at Gravity is. Next slide. What we do in terminology is really answer critical, just common questions across basic activities of care, identifying instruments, identifying diagnoses or conditions that need to be stated, identifying goals of care, and identifying the things we do to help address risks and conditions. And then we create language to define those things. Next slide. We want to just, as we start to make our master list, these concepts that we need more robust, we just wanted to generally remind everybody that we've done this now for 6 years. So in all of our domains, it's noted that connecting individuals to this core social care professionals and programs are critical. These roles like community health workers, social workers, care and case managers, peer support, community action agencies, community referral networks and platforms. And so they've become so critical consistently that they're just always included. And we have a value set of reference that holds space for them, and we just apply it to every domain. This is partly why you do not see them on the slides. It's because they're always there. So if you ever want to look at that, Sarah Bahal has the amazing Sarah Bahal has the link right there, but it's our general interventions value set that continuously populates every domain. Next slide. We are here. We are in our final concept development meeting. We have about, we're beginning of April, about 2 whole months left in our work. You'll see a lot of concepts coming to bear over the course of this. I'm really, again, grateful for National Indian Health Board for grounding us with their presentation today. Next slide. Any questions? At Gravity announcements, Gravity overview. All right, next slide. I just wanted to take a moment to really ground us every time now, especially at this moment in time, in principles of trauma-informed practices. We've been talking about this a lot with our subject matter experts, and a lot is happening in the ecosystem. So I thought we would just ground ourselves in this today before we do anything, and then bring ourselves back to this every time. Now, next slide. Whether it be the domains we're addressing or the current times, we are talking about trauma-informed care and trauma-informed principles within our work every day. And we wanted to take a moment to clearly highlight these principles. Again, grateful for the work for the Center for Healthcare Strategies. On the next slide. Next slide. These are adapted from briefs that are pretty critical in the publishing of SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Very, very critical for work of addressing mental behavioral health and substance use disorders and just general, wellness. Trauma-informed care seeks to realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand paths for recovery, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in patients, families, and staff. And this is a clinical perspective, that's why it's called staff. Integrate knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and actively avoid re-traumatization. Again, the core principles are establishing safety, trustworthy and transparency, peer support, collaboration, empowerment, and humility and responsiveness. I feel like in some sense, we've tried to integrate these practices since our inception. I just did not want to be remiss to not name them now. It's, times are challenging, and we just want to make sure that we're thinking well and grounding ourselves in the right principles as we do this work. Next slide. I now have the honor of passing the mic off very shortly to our friends at National Indian Health Board. One more slide. Next slide. Just to remind everybody, there's 2 roles you'll hear about protective factors within our work. They play a very specific role within our work in toxic stress, but generally, when we think and plan for protective factors, we talked about naming the strengths and assets we foster to promote, we assess and foster to promote well-being, holistic understanding, and capacity. And again, there's more to come in protective factors as a domain shortly. But right now, thank you, Lacey Wind, for coming to present. I'm going to stop sharing and allow Lacey to share. Again, our colleagues at National Indian Health Board, subject matter experts across many of our domains, will be leading us through a presentation for the next 20 to 30 minutes. Lacey, welcome. And Rochelle Ruffer is here as well. I just want to thank you, Rochelle, for coming. Right. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to go off camera and let Lacey take the helm.
Thanks for having me, everyone. I am Lacey Wind. I'm the Director of Public Health Programs and Policies, really long name. I'm so glad that we talked about trauma and you grounded us in there, because that is, you will hear that that's one of my pet peeves of just sharing words without really understanding what they mean. So today I'm going to talk to you about the Indigenous perspective, the American Indian, Alaska Native perspective. With that, just know that this information comes from my clinical work as a therapist, my integrated behavioral health background, and then also we were able to do a great ACEs project with CDC where we did an environmental scan, and we were able to really go around the United States and collect information about ACEs in the perspective of American Indians, Alaska Natives. So if you don't know us, I'm just going to tell you this is our mission. I'm not going to read it to you, but this is our mission, who we are. So we serve and advocate for all 574 federally recognized tribes. Our 12 board members are from the 12 IHS regions. So they really direct our work at the National Indian Health Board. And then we also are memberships through regional tribal health organizations. I just am putting up this. We're not going to go over it. You talked about trauma. I love that you grounded us in that and just didn't use trauma informed, because I think it's important to talk about what that actually means. One thing that I do want to talk a little bit about on this is decolonization, because we're going to talk a little bit about it today. So that's the right and ability of Indigenous people to practice self-determination over their land, culture, political, and economic systems. So when we talk about decolonization, we're not talking about erasing everything that happened and starting from the beginning, because we know that that's not going to happen, right? So we are going to talk about really about how we own what we do and how we live and what our interventions are. So we're going to go through some kind of grounding points before we get to protective factors, just so we're all on the same page. If you know this information, great. If you don't, great. But it's good to have grounding information so that we all understand where this information is coming from, and we're looking at it through the same lens. So the first thing is I really want to talk about is that of those 574 tribes, and state recognized tribes, right, we're actually not a race. We are 574 very different tribes with different cultures, different languages, different ceremonies. And so just to lump us up in a Western model to collect data isn't really a great way to think about us, and it's just good to recognize that we are all different, and in that respecting the diversity within the American and Alaska Native population. I gotta move my thing. So there, oh, we'll move it there. Okay. So just talking about some trauma terms, right? Acute trauma is a one-time event, one and done. Chronic trauma really involves repeated or prolonged exposure of harmful situations. And then we're talking about complex trauma, which stems from multiple traumatic experiences without the possibility of escape. This is kind of where American Indian and Alaska Natives are a little bit different. As a whole, we have a pretty 100% assumption that because of all of these other things, we walk around as with complex trauma, right? We are not, because of our culture and how we are interconnected, our family system, our tribal system is all interconnected. We really have to think about how that complex trauma gets us to where we are. So we also have to think about historical trauma, right? So that relocation, taking away the land. So we have Indigenous Health Service, because a part of the treaty was pretty much the US government took away our land and said, well, we will provide health care. The simulation policies in boarding schools, those are all historical trauma, the genocide, the disease. And I really want you to think that these pieces are important because they're grounded in shame. So the boarding schools, genocide, assimilation, were all to say, you're not good enough. You are not, you are a lesser person, a lesser race, which really really creates that shame within a person and passes down that trauma. And then that's where we really can see the impact of intergenerational trauma. So really that unconscious grief and loss, right, from historical trauma. Sometimes a lot of historical trauma, I think that we talk about that a lot, but we don't understand the connection. A lot of that time is that we are not, as individuals, making the connection or understand where that trauma is coming from, and we're passing it down. And that's the danger of trauma in general. So lots of cycle of abuse, cultural loss and identity, And then we talk about contemporary trauma, all of those kind of ACEs piece. The one thing that we don't talk a lot about, but it's extremely important, is lateral violence. So lateral violence is within our own tribe. And it really, I mean, if you think about blood quantum really created an environment of lateral violence, right? Because we are the only population in the world that have pedigree papers. So I could show you my pedigree papers just like a dog or a horse. We are the only people, and those pedigree papers are actually connected to resources. So in that piece, we traumatize each other within our own tribe because of that connecting to resources, kind of trying to get up on each other within that poverty piece, right? And so we continually, the US government continually created this environment to where we kind of turn on each other. And that's very, very true today. Okay, so that's my great-great-great-grandmother, by the way. She's cute. So let's talk a little bit about what historical trauma looks like. So we have the boarding schools. So those were really about save the man, kill the Indian, right? That became shame. That lost how we parent, that lost culture, that lost really that sense of who we are. And that actually started in the 1887, but actually my father was in boarding schools. So my father would be 76 now. So that was still happening. And so we really have to recognize those pieces, but those pieces on how they are transferred over to each other. The Dawes Act happened really. So what was happening is that they kept, the US government kept moving us from land to land. Land is connected to us. So every time they did that, that reshaped how we ate, how we did medicine, all of those pieces, and how we thought of ourselves, right? So because land is so important, when those things that the US government did with reshaping and moving us from land really impacted who we are as people. The Adoption Act, I think this is just blows my mind. In 1958 to 1967, the Adoption Act happened. And really what that was that they offered pretty much rich people, the cool thing to do was to adopt Indian children. So what happened was, and this is where the Indian Child Welfare Act kind of came in. So all of these children were removed from their families when they did have families there that would adopt them, would have taken care of them, would have had their culture. Instead, they were presented as kind of like the cool thing as an upper class white person would take in Indian children. And it really had an impact because like we said, right, as an Indian person, it doesn't matter if you were born out of the culture, you are always Indian and it's always within inside you. And so that when you do those things, those become really impactful. We know with suicide, we know that belonging is one of the #1 things to prevent suicide. So when you take somebody outside of that and that kind of feeling that they know they don't fit, that really is impactful. And then thinking, right, there was no separation on how, so Western wise, we compartmentalize medicine. It's easy data, we can collect it, we put it in boxes. In American Indian Alaska Natives, we do not. I would say we are ahead of the game a little bit, like just now in 2025, I think we're catching on in Western, that you can't take pieces away. So if in that thought that you can't take pieces away, such as, and you can't take pieces away from land and water, of spirit and self, if you can't practice religion, which is also your healthcare, that really creates poor health, right? So those are kind of those pieces when we talk about historical trauma and how it actually affects American Indians, Alaska Natives. So I just wanted to ground us kind of in that. Also in intergenerational. So we have that historical trauma. A lot of that pieces, right, become unconscious. So let's take boarding schools, for instance. Boarding schools, you didn't have that warmth of the parent. My dad used to talk about the mean nuns. You couldn't talk your language. If you did, you would get hit by a ruler. And so that shame piece, that role modeling of parent was never there. So then what happens is that you have these children and you don't know how to have affection. My dad didn't know how to hug. And so children internalize that, right? Why can't my father hug me? Is there something wrong with me? That really creates anxiety, shame, that really affects self. Because some of that trauma that happens is not acknowledged or understood by the person that's passing it on. So the next generation, it becomes confusing. So then we have the epigenetics, which really has shown that our genes are, because if we have trauma, our genes are changed and then they're passed down in a changed gene. And that can affect behavioral health, our behaviors, our physical health, all of those pieces when we pass down that trauma. And not understanding that trauma, which I think ACEs, the point of ACEs is, right? Like I understand where my trauma is coming from, and then what do I do? So this is kind of what the trajectory of intergenerational trauma. We had the boarding schools, relocation. We also relocated families and said, you can have $100 if you go to the city. That wasn't enough. They couldn't find jobs. They didn't have family to rely on, didn't have babysitters, right? Because you have aunts, uncles, grandmas, you have this whole different system of how you interact as a family. If you go and make this family become a nuclear family, it changes the dynamic. It changes how you function. And if nobody told you how to function in a nuclear family, it shakes everything up. So when they relocated, they couldn't find jobs. Their roles and responsibilities as parents was kind of all shook up. It caused a lot of substance use disorder and a lot of kind of that, again, that passed down trauma. The Indian Adoption Act, and then now today. And I would say that it is pretty amazing that now today in 2025 was the first time that we even acknowledged as the US government that boarding schools even happened, which blows my mind, right? Because if you don't acknowledge something, and we talk about that in trauma, if you don't acknowledge it, then it never happens. You can't talk about it. And it just recreates that shame and that trauma. And once you acknowledge it, then we can find solutions. And so I think that's really important to note that we, as the US government, only acknowledge that, 2024 with Biden. So then we have, on top of that, so we have this population, which I'm going to call it population even. I told you it wasn't a population, but this population that has historical trauma that gets confusing, you don't really understand what's happening, then you're passing that down, right? And your children don't really understand what's happening. And it kind of disrupts self, it really creates a lot of shame, misunderstanding. And so on top of all that, that's all passed down, we have then contemporary trauma because of the situations of being in a impoverished, lack of resources on reservations, and really as a population. So here's some facts. I put some ACEs scores in here. I want you to remember that we are 2% of the population. However, we have the highest ACEs score. So 2.32 is the average ACE score in American Indian and Alaska Natives. This is 50% higher than the white individuals, 40% higher than the Black. We're higher. I think it's also in higher because we as female are our birth givers, our life givers. And so understanding ACEs, understanding intergenerational trauma, understanding things that start from utero, that we have the highest ACEs for Alaskan Native and American Indian females. Oops, sorry. So American Indian Alaska Natives are 2 to 3 times more likely to have multiple ACEs compared to non-Hispanic white children. That is important, right? Because not only do we have this historical trauma, which probably creates some of that multiple ACEs, but we have intergenerational, then we have contemporary. So of course, we're going to score higher on the ACEs. Children with 2+ ACEs have a higher rate of anxiety and depression. We are 7 times more likely to experience unfair treatment, race, and ethnicity. And then 1.5 times more likely to live with families, difficulty covering basic food like housing, with divorce and separation, and a parent that has passed away. So again, that is pretty shocking if you understand that we're only 2% of the population. So this is all the kind of stuff that we are talking and why it makes a little bit different in this population as American Indian Alaska Natives. We have that historical trauma on top of that intergenerational, we have epigenetics, ACEs, and then we have collective trauma of all this stuff happening. And then we continue to have this acute trauma. So we continue to have complex grief. That is one thing that's a little bit different when you are in a tribal, community-based population, right? When I go back home, there is a funeral every other week. And not only a funeral, you're either related to them or you're really close to them. So you don't really ever get a chance to grieve. And it's just like grief on top of grief on top of grief. So obviously that creates substance use, that creates mental health issues. Your community doesn't get to really heal. That's continuous grief happening. Then we have that lateral violence, PTSD, systematic racism. So we have all of these things happening because we're not a nuclear family, right? Where ACEs was really a study of white males in a nuclear family that you could kind of put in a box, right? You could have it in its own little environment. You can't do that with American and Alaska Natives. All of this stuff is connected on top of each other. Families in the family system are all connected to each other. We all live in one household. It wouldn't be unusual to see, 3 generations in one house. And that's also why we can talk about why COVID was so traumatic when COVID went through and why it was a little bit different for American Indian Alaska Natives, because we are all interconnected and communal. So what ACEs is and what ACEs isn't, I think we should just kind of talk a little bit about this. So we talked about that it's adverse childhood experiences, right? Risk factors for toxic stress. So we're going to say, hey, you're probably more likely if you have a higher score to have more toxic stress and prolonged, which then is going to affect your health. We have higher scores or greater toxic stress and health risks, right? If we measure that. A screening tool to help clinicians identify at-risk individuals for early intervention. That's why we do it. We want that early intervention. And then that kind of integrated care where the ACEs kind of drive trauma-informed healthcare. What ACEs is not, and I really want to kind of think through this a lot. So ACEs, you need to know and understand why you're giving the ACEs. You cannot just give the ACEs because you want to do it in your clinic or you want to do it in your facility. There is a danger, especially with a population that has so much trauma and is you already know is going to have a high ACEs score, of giving an ACEs to them. So if you're just giving them the ACEs without understanding the why and the what, you then are having that person create self, as in, I'm a ACEs score of a 7, right? And I think that's a little bit of why I struggle with diagnoses too, right? We become, that's who we are. And so I hear a lot in Native communities is, I'm an ACEs of this. It's not a symptom-based screener, right? So it's not like a PHQ-9 or a GAD-7 where we can really measure whether or not we're improving or not. It is just telling us that we had trauma in our lives, and trauma possibly is going to create poor health outcomes. Not direct measure of toxic stress, right? Ongoing stress, lack of support, genetics, does not measure resilience, which I think is very, very important. We believe as people, everything is connected. So if we speak something, if we think something, that is what it is. So if we say we're an ACEs of a 7, our interventions are going to be of a traumatic 7. If we say we are a resilience people and we talk more positivity, our interventions are going to be more positive. So I think we have to also think about that when we think about the why and what we're going to use those ACEs for. Not a sole focus for treatment. So it underlines treatment and addresses underlying stressors and promotes resilience and provides support services. And then we can't measure, which is a little bit about the symptom base, right? We can't measure the impact of frequency, the intensity, and how chronic it is. And that is super important when we talk about American Indians, right? Because we have all of these multiple layers happening. We rarely have acute trauma. You would not find an American Indian Alaska person that had acute trauma, and that's all they had, right? You have that historical trauma, that intergenerational trauma, and then you have acute trauma. So that is very, very different. These are the symptoms. We know these things. But I think that these are important because when you think of all the multiple trauma that we have, and then we're going to school, and you're not understanding why, right? Like if we talk about historical trauma, we're not understanding why we're always in the fight or flight mode. We don't truly understand why we're worried or scared, which could be because of genocide, because of the trust of people coming in and that being passed down, but not talked about, but the feelings being passed down from grandparent to parent to child. And so you kind of are always on edge and worried, but you can't really pinpoint it because the cause was not talked about and passed down. Oh, sorry, I'm like cruising. Okay. It's experience dependent. So really thinking about when we're talking about maternal health, because the stress hormone is passed down to the baby. It really thinking about preventative when we think about the why, right? Why are we doing it in a child, and how are we going to use that in our healthcare to prevent that? That is very important because it does affect, that toxic stress affects our whole body, and especially it affects our brain. So if you're having multiple things that are happening, so you have the historical, intergenerational, then you have the acute ACEs impact, and then you're going into school where you're already feeling shameful. You're not really sure why your body is reacting the way that it is. How are you going to be treated when, you know, your memory is affected? You kind of overreact. You have triggers that you're not really sure where they're at. And even if you sat down, you probably couldn't figure them out because they're from your great grandparents that passed down that emotion, right? That life isn't safe. And so you're having all of this stuff, and then you're going into a classroom where you're supposed to learn, and all of these things are then impacting you. So again, that's where more acute trauma is happening because of all this passed down pieces. And you can't figure that piece out in an ACEs score. I just like this. This is one of my favorites. So this is Dr. Warren. If you've ever seen his stuff, it's great. But it really talks about all of these pieces in American Indians create kind of the social determinants of health, our WIC, and obviously at the end create that chronic disease disparity. One thing that I think is a good example that fry bread is not a cultural food. Fry bread is something that was made from the rations that was given to us, right? Because you can make it with water, baking powder, and flour, and a little bit of sugar and salt. That then greasy bread became something that we thought was cultural. That then becomes, you know, poor eating, which we know then that increases why we have such high diabetes. Not because of fried bread, but because of the concept of the poor foods that we eat, because of all of these things. I'm glad that we talked about in the beginning, you guys talked about social determinants of health, because these are extremely important because like we said, we are not a nuclear system. All of these pieces are connected to us, and we need to acknowledge the social determinants of health. In that, we are also a little bit unique because we're so interconnected. Our social determinants of health, also, we need to add things and they look different, right? So we need to add what we talked about is all the colonial, all the traumas. We have to think about the ancestor teaching, the cultural ways of knowing, biodiversity and land. We have to think about tribe and community because those are interconnected to us. We have to think about family. We have to think about language because language is how we pass on culture, how we think about ceremony. If we're going to talk to the ancestors, we have to talk to ancestors, not in English because they don't speak English, right? And so language is really important in passing that down. So your social determinants of health, also we have to think through. We have some articles at NIHB. This is kind of the bigger version you guys can look at that kind of looks at the more expanded version of social determinants of health. So decolonizing, again, we think that everything is connected. So what we speak, what our spirit is how our intervention is. So the caution is, if we look at the pyramid of the ACEs pyramid, look how it looks. It's like at the end, we're going to have early death. So if we go in and we're looking at this pyramid, our intervention and how we then come as a patient is going to be negative, right? Like, gosh, I already come with all of this trauma. I'm going to have an early death. Like, and then if we think it's going to become, and we really believe that. So if you read a great article by Megan Rides the Door, she flips the ACEs model and flips the language to a more cultural thought and a more positive thought of what we would think of as we do interventions. And this is kind of where your protective factors come in, right? You talk about intergenerational healing, tribal sovereignty. We own our own healing. We own how to do it. Then we thrive as a community. Then if we thrive as a community, our children have positive childhood and community experiences and so on to have, in the end, a meaningful life. and we have longevity. So flipping, decolonizing it is really flipping that perspective, flipping that language so that we can have our patients can see positive things, our interventions can be positive, and then we speak as a spirit to it in a positive way. So if you want to read that article, it's a great article. So again, like decolonizing means that we can't like erase history. It happened. Historical happened, cultural loss happened, all of those pieces. So really thinking about and teaching our children that those are the boulders of life, right? We know that those are going to be in your path, but we want to teach our children to be more like water. Be clever like water, where we can go around the boulder, we can go over the boulder, but we can still move forward. And in thinking of that, we're going to think of that in protective factor language. We're going to think of that as how we're cleverly moving across with that water. We're going to do that through culture, because culture brings belonging. We know that belonging then prevents suicide. We know that connectiveness, especially in this day and age with electronics, connectiveness is important. And we as American Indians thrive on connectiveness because we are all connected in everything. So really that protective factor piece is important to integrate if you're going to do those ACEs, right? Because your interventions are going to be healthier. Your patient is going to think into healthier, and they're really going to be able to be that clever water and get over those boulders. So the other thing, and I just put this up because they're all different screeners, what we heard, and this is the last thing that I'll talk about, but what I heard from everybody across the country is that, first of all, we're storytelling people. And so if people are going to use ACEs, the why has to be as a story. So that is just a piece of your story. And how then can that start conversation? How then can that start that preventative talk? What screeners can I connect with that to make it a better, cleaner story? Making sure that we are training people on the why, right? Like we're not going into primary care and the nurse isn't looking at us and just asking the question. We can't be doing those things. So really thinking through the why, the how, and then what are we going to do with that information is really important. How are we going to build that big story as a patient as a whole? And we really heard that that was important. I'm just putting this up because we talk about it. The one thing that I would talk about recommendations is that we have to do a two-eyed seeing approach. We are also cannot assume that every American Indian Alaska Native smudges or practices cultural, right? Because we have a simulation. So we have to always think of that person as an individual in what they believe and not make those assumptions, but we have to integrate that Western style with our American Indian indigenous wisdom. And we have to think about how to be able to bill for our indigenous practitioners, because those pieces need to come back to us in order to heal us. So sorry I went a little bit long. Any questions, comments?
No, sorry, Lacey. That's amazing. It's amazing work. Thank you so much. Please don't apologize. And I want to note, we actually have a friend, Jessica, who also, I don't know, Jessica, if you want to come and speak as well. So, but we have multiple perspectives on the role of protective factors. And so if anyone has, Jess, if you want to say anything quickly, because Jessica has to go in 5 minutes and hopefully we can get questions. Hello, Jessica.
Hi, thank you, Lacey. Nice to meet you, and very helpful context listening to what all you shared. And I feel like what I was going to share overlaps a lot with what you were saying about protective factors and connectedness. And what I can do, So I'm Jessica Sunnygook Ulrich. I am a tribal citizen of Nome Eskimo community. I work at Washington State University as an assistant research professor in the iReach program. It's the Institute for Research to Advance Education and Community Health. Love the acronyms out there, right? But part of my background is I worked in child welfare for a number of years, and I went back to school because I felt like this system is not getting at the root. We're not helping children and families that I felt like we needed. We needed more community resources, interventions that got at helping families heal from these ACEs and intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, and all of those sorts of things. So I went back to school and I learned about that concept of connectedness, came across an article, and I can share that article with you too, but that define that term as the interrelated welfare of an individual, family, a community, and the earth. And I loved that. That's what the People's Awakening team of Southwest Alaska defined connectedness as. And I was like, that's what's missing. That broader holistic view was missing in this systemic intervention that was, I felt like, compounding the trauma rather than alleviating a lot of it for children, by removing children from their parents, and not just their parents. In an interview with foster care alumni, I learned they're removed from their siblings, from their aunties, uncles, grandparents, community, culture, history, daycare, favorite toys and playgrounds, and just on and on. This removal was not just from their parents. So that's where I'm like, we got to broaden our perspective here. So in my research, if it's okay, I'll share screen in just a couple slides. I've given this presentation numerous times now, but I just wanted to share a couple things. So I had created an Indigenous connectedness framework. This is what I adapted for my tribe. Let me show you the connectedness framework first. After doing research with child welfare knowledge bearers in Alaska, I updated the connectedness framework to look like this. So this is that acknowledgement of the trauma and disconnect and challenges that many people felt were disruptive to them having connectedness relationships with their family, the community, with knowing who their ancestors are, understanding their role in the current life that they're living, and the future generations dependent on what they do, what actions they take in this lifetime. And then with the earth, and how these relationships, if there's a lot of disruptions, it's not to say that we get through life unscathed, but if these kind of happen too frequently and it's overwhelming, I feel like that affects our internal connectedness. So that I was sort of hearing Lacey talk about that a little bit, where we become disconnected from ourselves. We don't know who we are and how we fit in this world, and we don't know where we come from, and we feel insecure and maybe adopt some of these trauma beliefs about who we are, and how that affects our inner ecology. And so Oscar Coagli, a Yupik scholar, wrote about that, and I finally understood like how important these relationships are. You know, if we don't have strong, healthy relationships with not just our family, I feel like, or with ourselves, but with the land, with the animals, the water, the air, with so much more, with spirit, our concept of spirit and culture, then we have those inner struggles that then affect, it's this reciprocal relationship. It affects how we show up in relationship, and it affects our whole community. It affects our whole family. It affects potentially future generations. It affects the whole earth. You know, like that's how important each of us are, and in our healing journeys and our wellness journeys. And so this outer circle here, I think, you know, if you want to call it protective factors, call it protective factors, but these relational actions are what build and sustain healthy connectedness relationships. And so this is what it looks like within an Indigenous lens, but even within an Indigenous lens, like my version of dance and culture is different from, the Seminole Indians in Florida. Like it, so there's a beautiful diversity that exists. It's not a one size fits all. It has to be adapted and made to better fit each of the tribal communities. And this is where my tribe heard me present on it, and they said, we want you to build a curriculum. And I worked with them, and we thankfully talked to community elders and leaders and got feedback on that curriculum. And they pretty much, they liked this. This is what we adapted the connectedness framework to look like. But it was the way we were going to teach it that drastically changed. The sit-down lecture, style, have a discussion in a sort of like a classroom setting was not going to cut it. So we instead created wellness workshops for whole families to come out, and we just engaged in all of our different subsistence cultural activities for a weekend, knowing that some people have become disconnected from this knowledge and some of these skills and values. And so that's what they said, our subsistence way of life will teach everything that they need to know. And we saw that happen, and that connectedness was built, and all the children started calling each other cousins. And there was an elder who was crying and thanking us for helping him feel more comfortable stepping into an elder role. We had parents exchanging phone numbers to stay connected after this one weekend workshop. It was phenomenal. Lots of love and healing and wellness. And that's what I'm like, this is it. This is what we got to get back to. And how when we live this, it's the action piece that matters. That's what leads to the reconnectedness. We're all in this process of healing and well-being and defining what that means for each of us. And I can't define who you are. You have to do that for yourself. But if all of us link arms and we're coming together and we're reforming our circle and engaging in this, Harold Napoleon wrote a book called You, Your Hawk, The Way of the Human Being. Powerful 20 pages, available for free as a PDF online. Highly recommend it. He shares that this is what we need to do, reform our circle. The circle being spirit can only be repaired by love, understanding, kindness, forgiveness, and patience. With the help of the creator who established the circle, it can only be done by its people coming together in truth. So the more we foster that, the more we provide opportunities for that to happen, that's the medicine, that's the healing, that's the health and wellness. And I feel like we need a different theory of change. So a lot of, I think, systemic approaches are problem deficit focused and trauma focused, and then this belief in like it's more of a reactive system, and it's less about connection, but treating people like disconnected individuals. And then outside experts are the ones that supposedly have the solutions, and then the intervention is a cookie cutter approach. It's like a canned intervention, expecting it to fit and match everybody. That's not going to work. That doesn't work anymore. So this is what I'm saying. This is my theory of change I'm putting out there. This is what we need to do. This is what will work, is always setting an intention, having that groundedness. And this is why we're doing this, for the love of our children, our people, our future generations, our ancestors, this earth, our community, and our family. We are wellness focused. We are strengths focused. Despite all this stuff that's happened, all the boulders in the river, we're still here, and we are proud of who we are. We are loving people. And then we approach and do this work in this relational way. We listen to those from the community, from within, as the experts, knowing that we all think we know what we're doing, but we don't. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all these outcomes and struggles that we're still facing today. And then our job as learners and listeners, working and collaborating with community, is to be creative and responsive. And then go, okay, they gave, just like with the curriculum, it ended up not being a curriculum at all. It's like, this is a whole pedagogy. We're just going to get together and connect and do what our ancestors knew. And it worked. So, this is where I'm like, this is where I'm at. These are the protective factors to me. And it's about reconnection. And so what are those factors that help us reconnect? And that's the work, and where more research is needed. And, I think there's a lot to learn about this aspect of ancient knowledge that sustained communities for generations prior to colonization. Like, there's so much wisdom in there. One of my language group elders said, we need old time solutions using new time tools. And I just thought that was beautiful. It was brilliant. And that's exactly what I feel like I'm in the process of engaging in and learning about. And the other project I was going to briefly mention was I was working on a suicide prevention study in Alaska for 7 years. It took that long, but working with 65 rural communities, hosting annual collaborative gatherings, sharing. It was a ongoing reciprocal, like sharing knowledge, getting feedback, kind of member checking the whole time. But we were able to come up with community level protective factors. And that's what I feel like is totally innovative and new in terms of the, I think a lot of focus is on individuals typically, but this is looking at what those protective factors are at a community level. And some of them, I'll share screen again. I have one more graphic, and then I do have another meeting I gotta jump off to. But we just had this article published recently, so that's what I'll send out to you all. And this is this got sent out to all the tribal leaders. It's like a policy sort of brief, quick snapshot of all the results of our years-long effort. But these are the community protective factors that when there's a strong tribal governance that is sovereign, self-determined, community engaged, and there's cooperation amongst all the different government entities within the community, that's a protective factor. Providing youth with opportunities for like summertime work or internships or leadership sort of roles and responsibilities within the community, that's a protective factor. Ensuring that all outside teachers coming in to work within the school, for example, and healthcare providers, law enforcement, that they learn about the local community context and culture and history, that's a protective factor, as well as providing and having ongoing gatherings, ceremonies, and those sorts of practices, that there's collegial relationships, I guess, between churches and traditional healers and those kind of aspects. So that all leads to and we have research that shows this leads to less suicide death and less suicide attempts. So I'm like, we have this, the interventions I feel like that we could build could focus on promoting that community health. And when we promote community health, that will lead to family and youth health and well-being. So it's that understanding it's not up to any one person to just heal yourself and everything's going to be fine. It's no, we need a collective response. We need to understand that we're all connected to a collective. And so what you do over there and the community you're in, it is interconnected, and it does have an effect on my community over here. So whether we're conscious of that or not, and that's part of what I heard Lacey share too. So yeah, I'm sorry I can't stay much longer, but I'll share lots of resources with you all.
Thank you. Lacey, thank you. Thank you so much. Any questions for these? I mean, I know Jessica, you have to go. Luckily, you'll send resources, and I'm going to try to pull her. She's very busy and wasn't able to participate in the SME meetings regularly, but we try to pull her wisdom in whenever we can. Thank you so much. Any questions for Lacey, Dennis, or Jessica?
Yeah.
I know you have to go. You can leave. I respect your time.
Yeah, I just want to say real quick, something that jumped out at me in the slides was the term justice, right? And then you mentioned it again later, because whenever I see that word, I live close to the Urban Indian Health Institute, so I've gone to some classes there. But the word justice, does it mean, the justice that's brought, whatever, like police and all that justice, or, justice for each individual to find some sort of peace? And I was curious about that. She's not here.
I'll just say really quick, justice to me is when we no longer engage in trauma. So like trauma is someone is harming another person and another person is the recipient of this harm. It's like there's disruption, trauma, disconnect, a rupture. And to me, justice is when we engage in that process of repairing that relational harm that happened. And for people to no longer be a victim and to no longer be, I don't like the word perpetrator, but like to be the one that causes harm in other people's lives. And so when we free ourselves, that we're liberated from sort of being caught in this binary sort of situation. That is to me justice. That's when I know I am no longer going to be harmed, and then this person who harmed is no longer like we're in right relationship again. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah, it
I
does.
think
Thank you. That was what I was
yeah,
wondering.
yeah.
Matt, one more question, and then I do want to try to let these amazing women segue into their next role. Matt?
Just so much amazing presentations here. Some of the best stuff I've seen since Gravity started. I think you folks get at two elements that we have kind of problem system-wide across all our healthcare system. And the first is the focus on the that you're focusing on strengths, right? And the protective factors and how we can lead from those strengths to address social needs, adverse experiences, traumas, etc. And you're also not the other component is you focus on the community level as well, right? And what I'm concerned about is like just across the entire sector, we really lack the tools, and even when we are going through and we're defining individual, assessment questions or diagnoses, etc., we're not asking the question, does this assessment question ask about something that is impacting the household level? Is it describing something that is asking about the neighborhood level, etc.? And so, I mean, what advice would you have for the broader SCOH community outside of Native Americans, of how we can kind of learn from this approach?
Lacey, I'm not meaning to dominate
Go ahead, Jessica.
the
Go
answer.
first.
Okay. I was just going to say that I think we have to keep questioning the narrative and keep thinking bigger and broader. So for example, with like this current administration and how disruptive and like it is traumatic. I feel like every day I don't know what's going to come next, and it's like we ignore this societal trauma response that's happening, this collective trauma response, and keep just focusing on with our blinders on individuals. And it's like, we've done that for so long. And that's what I saw in child welfare. We're focusing on parent-child dyads and not understanding the bigger effect it's having, not only on this parent and child, but on the family and the community. And that's what tribes have been saying. That's why we have an Indian Child Welfare Act, you know, but I think there has to be some practice changes in changing our theories and our understanding of health and wellness and trauma and, you know, relationships and all of this in order to expand our view. And I don't have, you know, all the answers. I think the first step is to go, well, what does that look like? How is our system or whatever it is that we're operating, practicing within, potentially compounding the trauma or adding to the harm? And I feel like we operate in so many silos too. And that's where I was like, you know, child welfare alone is not going to address what is at the root. It is all the systems, you know. So that's where we as leaders can come together. And that's where what I have hope with this work that everyone is engaging in is to change the narrative, to change the focus, so that we're actually getting at those solutions instead of reinventing the wheel and having cookie cutter approaches and just uninnovative ideas that do more harm than good.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Wes.
Jessica. I think I would add also, just to enhance what Jessica said, we have to take time to listen to the full story, right?
Mm.
Which is hard in a 20-minute, 40-minute appointment. But we have to either do that as a team-based approach or, you know, building in our community resources, all of those stuff within breaking those silos down within your facility. Western View really wants to compartmentalize it because it's easy to fix, right? If we have one thing, we can fix that. And so that doesn't work. So we need to take that time to listen to the full story and then decide an intervention from there, because we're all interconnected, but we're all still individuals too and had individual experiences. So how we balance that is you have to listen to the full story.
Yes. uh, thank you so much,
Thank you.
friends. It was an honor to learn from you both today. Thank you so much for coming. Any other final thoughts before we go into we'll cover a few other things, but probably give most of our time just to reflecting on what we heard today. Other final thoughts? Thank you.
I guess I'm wondering how we can build on what we've heard today. For many of us, this is a learning experience from virtually ground zero. So I certainly am grateful for starting on a learning curve here. But the output of Gravity is all individual focused with codes to be applied to what's found about them in our typical Western healthcare setting. So I'm wondering, I would say instinctively, it's not clear to me how this is going to affect our work, but I'd rather put it positively. Can we, in this segment of our work, change anything to be more consistent with the presentations that we've heard today?
Lucy, I want to thank you for that. And I just want to highlight a couple clear opportunities. Number one, we do try to name, well, first of all, the radical act of addressing strengths as a thing of its own, right? Just want to name that. And then we do try to name, and you'll see some themes in that, like organizational and system level responsibilities and interventions throughout our work. And I think what the challenge for the fall is really a challenge of how do we not think about the person? Like, how do we think about food access and neighborhood safety and access to green space as primary interventions, right? And like step outside of the one and think about the community. And how do we ensure standards represent that contextually? So we're leaning into it. No solutions yet, but I hope we lean into it together.
Sarah, as usual, a step ahead of all the rest of us. Thank you, Sarah.
With you. Thank you so much, Lacey and Jessica. Thank you so much, Rochelle, for your continued subject matter expertise, bringing the wisdom of National Indian Health Board into our domains. We're so, so grateful. Thank you. And I'm gonna pivot and yes, Mark. Yeah, and we have some catching up to do at Gravity, certainly on that count. I'm trying to do our best. All right. I'm going to try to cover a few other things over the next, we have 12 minutes. I feel like the toxic stress concepts are pretty well covered here. So Asha and Sarah, there's a lot of content in toxic stress we'll circle back around on in 2 weeks because our subject matter experts from ACEs Aware couldn't be here anyway today. If we can close just on the racism concepts, I feel like that if we skip the whole next set, yeah, if we address this and then let the toxic stress elements be on the like people will see them on the master list and we'll talk about them in 2 weeks. Does that seem okay? Just to click because this is a tidy little. Okay, I'm saying it's okay. Thank you so much, Lacey and Jessica. I want to now go into the concepts, person level racism concepts that have been updated since we last gathered, and walk you through them. I think there's only a few key updates and we want to make sure that we address them. Next slide. There's no updates in instruments. Next slide. We are doing something different. We're doing something a little different in our presentations today. We're doing 3 domains at once. It's difficult for us to repeat things that we've said before. So from now on, if we've addressed instruments in a prior meeting, we're not pulling them on the slides again, but you can always find them on the master. Nothing's changed unless something's changed and there's a new addition. There's no new additions in any of our domains within instruments. They've been constant for the last month. Next slide. Next slide. We did settle on a core definition for racism that will drive our work based on the foundational gold standard literature of Williams and Collins. Racism is viewed as incorporating ideologies of superiority, negative attitudes and beliefs toward racial and ethnic outgroups, and differential treatment of members of those groups by both individuals and societal institutions. You will see this definition be incorporated into the concepts and terms that we are naming in our work over the next couple months. Next slide. Next slide. I addressed this, but we have 3 really concepts that we're addressing. Concepts in just like being a target of racism, concepts of the intersection of racism and discrimination and trust, and concepts on internalized racism. And this harkens back in part to what Lacey was speaking about regarding lateral violence. And you'll see themes of that in the concepts that we are addressing next. Next slide. There's a couple updates here. We are exploring the word victim in our SNOMED CT term for racism. Victim is a current concept, but it doesn't sit well or sit right. So we're kind of leaning into whether to use the word target. That is the naming convention of ICD. We have 2 new internalized racism concepts, trying to really define the stories that needed to be told from the subject matter expert perspective. One is internalized racism affecting healthcare outcomes. This is within healthcare teams and healthcare supervision. Another that's very exploratory, hence the parenthetical, but we present it initially today, is how perceptions of self are affected by internalized racism. And this harkens to what Lacey was talking about regarding shame. We have 2, and also the concepts of that she was mentioning regarding blood quantum and components like that. We have an
Sarah,
update. Yeah.
what does blood quantum mean?
I am not going to speak to that, but it's a way of defining indigeneity. I will give you, we'll pull in a reference.
Thank you.
I don't see either Lacey or but I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but there is a, very clear, there's briefs on it that we can put in and share in the chat and after the call. We've updated our trust concepts really in response, Lucy, to what you were mentioning regarding trust, not just affecting healthcare teams, but social care teams, to really help develop just one inclusive concept about how discrimination and racism affect trust and service provision. We explored having 2 different concepts, but then realized the settings are so vast that the service provision concept seemed a better inclusive term to define how discrimination and racism affect trust generally in receiving care. Next slide. And
Sarah,
yeah.
to go back to the previous, has it ever come up how experience of racism, understanding of racism, I'm looking at the last row here, affects provision of services? I mean, we're talking here about a person encountering services, but a racist society creates services that include, embody, symbolize, and perpetuate racism. So is that in here somewhere?
It's not in here yet. We did talk about representing structural racism and its association with access to services and are exploring concepts therein.
Thank you.
Similarly to how we explored them within incarceration status, how legal matters can affect access to everything. That's in the hopper.
Thank you.
I would like to just close with the goal. Oh, Mark?
Thanks. Just a related question then. When we're talking about racism, quote unquote, here, does that also include structural racism, or is it meant to not yet get to structural racism? Thank you.
For the purposes of our work, and we addressed this early, we are not, we are talking about personal level experiences of racism, but we are, as I mentioned with Lucy, trying to name how structural racism affects people. So we're not defining structural racism as its own thing, but we would be remiss in thinking about how structural racism affects health, wealth, and access to services. So we're exploring that, but not directly structural racism as a concept. I talked about how it directly relates to outcomes, how it relates to indicators. We've reviewed lots of lit, but that's the approach we're taking right now for right now. All right, I'm going to end on goals because these are important to close with. Makes me think about our presentation today, like where we're heading. Next slide, and then understanding there will be concepts in toxic stress on the master list that we did not get time to speak to today, but we will come back in 2 weeks and talk about them. As we work to name person level, and Lucy, this is partly what we were talking about before. So as we work to name person level goals for targets of racism, it's ethically imperative that we also name goals for the care team and organization. Care team and organization goals are best accompanied by established means of accountability. We've been very clear, our subject matter experts have been very clear that the burden of goal setting should not be entirely on the person who is experiencing racism. The system needs to change to meet the person. So to do this, and from an accountability lens, Gravity is reaching out and working with colleagues in the ecosystem who have existing standards for anti-racism and anti-discrimination, such as the Joint Commission, to align whatever concepts we build organizationally to establish standards that care entities are already accountable to. So the aim will build organizational terms with implementation weight, and more to come on that. Again, grateful for our colleagues in the ecosystem who already have standards for organizational and care team anti-racism and anti-discrimination concepts that we can reference so that we are building them with teeth. Next slide. Lastly, just going to focus on our goal concepts. Again, thank you for being with us today. It was really important to give time to our friends at National Indian Health Board and Jessica, who came to present her research. You'll hear a lot of those approaches within our strengths-based protective factor work that's going to be developing more over the course of the next 2 months. But insofar as our goal concepts, the person level goal is the concept that's well defined in the literature of adaptively coping. There's references that we'll be able to share and put on the complements to define that. We have care team level goals. And again, this is like, as much as we think about the person, we really are trying to name the care team concepts. Respectful care is a concept that's widely known throughout maternal health equity work. And so that will be a concept that we're focusing on. Collaborative care is a concept that's widely known through mental behavioral health concepts. But generally ensuring that as we build goals, we're considering accountability. The reason why we leaned into respectful care and collaborative care as concepts is because they have existing frameworks and literature and are well known as accountability pathways for care teams. But generally exploring what organizational accountability looks like, and again, partly trying to ensure that whatever concepts we build align with standards that entities are already accountable to. Again, thinking about uniform data specifications with federal qualified health centers, Joint Commission, and NCQA. More to come there. I think that is the content that we have time for today, and it's 5:30. Again, the master list will be posted tomorrow, end of day. There is a lot of new content to come, and we'll talk more about some of the content we didn't get to when we come back in 2 weeks. Review the master lists. Thank you for your time.
Sarah,
Incredible. Yeah.
I need to interject that in 2026, we should start talking about the education of health providers and not just aligning with organizations that they may be employed by. They come into those organizations already full of assumptions.
Wessie you are speaking to the choir.
I'm sure I am.
And I want to note that our member lead on this, American Medical Association, is deeply involved has been and was deeply involved in partnering education with incoming residents and med students.
That's great.
Yeah.
Let's talk more about that next year.
Thank you, friends, for your time and deep appreciation for our friends at National Indian Health Board and Jessica who came and presented. Rochelle, thank you for bringing the wisdom of NIHB to our domains, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.